The fifth best NFL quarterback in the 1960s, Dandy Don Meredith. In Don's career, he threw for over 17,000 yards, 135 touchdowns, and for the era, a very impressive quarterback rating of just a hair under 75. His career was entirely in the 1960s. Known for his grit and toughness and leadership, he was a Pro Bowler in the season 66 through 68, and he led the Cowboys to the NFL championship games in 67 and 66. Unfortunately, they faced the mighty Green Bay Packers and lost both of those games. Don Meredith was actually drafted by George Halas in the Chicago Bears and very shortly thereafter traded to the expansion Dallas franchise, who at the time hadn't even picked their head coach, hadn't even picked their nickname of the Cowboys yet. So a lot of people consider Don Meredith to be the very first Cowboy ever. One interesting story I read while I was researching this little project. He is credited with having thrown the longest pass in NFL history that didn't have any yards after the catch. An 83-yard pass to Hall of Fame wide receiver Bob Hayes. The fourth best NFL quarterback in the 1960s, one of my favorite quarterbacks, Hall of Famer Fran Tarkenton. He was the third leading passer in the 1960s with over 23,000 yards passing, 186 touchdowns, which was second most in the decade. And he had a quarterback rating of 81, which was the fourth best rating in the decade. Despite all of those great passing numbers, his real superpower is that he could run with the football. He's considered by most people to be the first dual threat quarterback in NFL history. In the 1960s alone, he rushed for over 2,600 yards and scored 20 touchdowns. His first NFL career game was on September 17th, 1961. It was against the Chicago Bears. He threw for 250 yards and 4 touchdowns, rushed for a 5th touchdown, and they won the game. Not a bad way to start your career. Thanks for watching my video, everybody. If you've made it this far, if you could take 1 second and just please click that subscribe button, I would really, really appreciate it. Thank you. The third best quarterback in the 1960s, Hall of Famer Sonny Jurgensen. Sonny Jurgensen might be the most underrated quarterback in NFL history. During the 1960s, he threw for over 26,000 yards, which was only 300 short of Johnny Unitas's league-leading total. And we'll talk more about Johnny Unitas in a minute. Sonny also had 207 touchdown passes during the decade, which was the number one total. And he had a quarterback rating of 82, which was the third highest rating during the decade. He played for the Philadelphia Eagles the first 4 years of the decade and then was traded to the Washington Redskins and played the last 6 years of the decade with them. 1961 was probably his best season. He tied the NFL record that year for most touchdown passes at 32, and he broke the NFL record for passing yards with over 3,700. Then, in 1967, he broke his own passing yardage record with 3,747 yards. He led the league in passing 5 times during that decade, and he was a 5-time Pro Bowler. Okay, number 2. Vince Lombardi said that Johnny Unitas was the best quarterback he had ever seen play, and Johnny Unitas is actually credited with being the first quarterback to perfect the 2-minute drill. For the decade, Unitas led the league in passing yards with over 26,500 yards. His 8.0 yards per attempt was second best during the decade. His 212 yards per game led the decade. His 182 touchdown passes was third best, and he had a passer rating for the length of the decade of 82.0. In 1960, Johnny Unitas became the first quarterback ever in NFL history to pass for over 3,000 yards in a single season. He was an 8-time Pro Bowler during the decade and a 2-time MVP. He was a 3-time MVP, but only twice during the 60s. In an era where a quarterback rating over 80 was exceptional, in 1964, Johnny Unitas had a passer rating of 96.4, And then in 1965, his passer rating was even higher at 97.4. The best story I saw of Johnny Unitas, he was actually drafted by the Pittsburgh Steelers, never played a game for them. They cut him. He had to go back home. He worked construction for a year, played some semi-pro ball for $6 a game before he was signed by the Baltimore Colts in 1956. And the greatest quarterback in the NFL in the 1960s, Green Bay Packers legend, Bart Starr. Compared to these other guys, Bart Starr's passing yardage and his touchdown passes aren't that impressive. His superpower was all in his accuracy. He led the decade with a passer completion rating of 59%, which was not even close. Second place was not even close. His yards per average for the decade was 8.3. His passer rating for the decade was by far the best at 87.7. Again, in an era where a passer rating of over 80 is phenomenal, 6 times in the 1960s, Bart Starr had a passer rating of over 89, and twice his passer rating was over 100. Bart Starr was a 1966 NFL MVP. The reason I gave the number 1 spot to Bart Starr and not Johnny Unitas is because of Bart Starr's 5 NFL championships, plus his 2 Super Bowl victories. Not only did he win all those championship games, but in his 9 postseason games that he played in the 60s, he threw 14 touchdowns to only 3 interceptions and had a passer rating of over 105. Okay, so there's my top 5 quarterbacks of the 1960s. I hope you enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun. I learned a lot of things when I was researching that project, and I do have some cards to give away here. But before I do that, a couple of real quick honorable mentions. One, John Brody. His numbers were very comparable to Don Meredith's. I had a hard time picking which one to put 5th. And Roman Gabriel, his numbers are phenomenal. His problem was that he didn't start playing regularly until 1966, but he had a very low completion, a very high completion percentage, and a very low interception percentage. He was a 1969 MVP, great football player. I know some of you are going to come at me and say he should have been on the list and not Don Meredith. Okay.